So there were three articles this week, mostly dealing with the topic of self-care. The first article is The Politics of Conspicuous Displays of Self-Care, mainly talking about a brief overview of the topic. It became apparently a collective social practice in 2016 after the election of Donald Trump. Like self-reliance, the article points out that self-care stems from puritanical values of self-improvement and self-examination, and that philosophers from antiquity to today have emphasized the importance of self-care. It was especially emphasized how citizenship in America has often been defined across history in terms of a person's ability to care for themselves, and this was often used to disenfranchise African Americans, Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as women as a whole, and that self-care was often popularized as a whole by those who feel disenfranchised. Like Audre Lorde stated, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And essentially that self-care was seen as a way of showing an oppressive society that one was worth caring for. Interesting take on how to fight those in power that are disenfranchising you, in my opinion. And that many communities, such as African Americans and LGBTQ Americans, are taking to public displays of self-care, especially over social media and in reaction to unfortunate shootings in which members of both groups were killed. Now, there is also a huge push to portray self-care as unselfish, with the argument that one cannot truly care about and love other things without caring for and loving themselves, and that if someone doesn't care or love themselves, or even think that they have value, then clearly the things that they value can easily be seen as equally meaningless, and vice versa. If you value yourself, the things that you value can be seen as having actual value. Now, personally, I think that self-care's selfishness depends on the degree of that self-care. Plenty of these sentiments seem to condone valuing oneself above all else, such as the @selfcarebot tweet, "No matter what, you need to do what's best for you," and Yvette Dion saying, "And so saying that I matter, that I come first, that what I need and what I want matters." Then there are the Twitter captions completely unconcerned with "what's not mine" and "but first, you." It's always important to care for yourself and not let any individuals or society as a whole make you feel less about yourself or prevent you from taking care of yourself. However, to condone placing yourself above everything else, saying that you come first, it's a very dangerous attitude to have. I think it's fair to say that many atrocities that have been committed throughout history have happened because someone or a group of people put their desires over everything else and stopped at nothing to achieve what they wanted. Now, clearly, these are extreme examples that wouldn't apply to most people. However, the sentiment is the same. How could a society comprised of individuals who are all focused solely with their own desires above that of everyone and everything else function? I don't think society could function that way. And self-care as a whole, selfishness, is determined by how much you are willing to put yourself above other things. Now, the movement itself is largely powered by straight, affluent white women, who aren't exactly the most disenfranchised people out there. However, I do not believe that self-care should only be practiced by the disenfranchised. I don't think it should matter who you are or how well off you are compared to everyone else. You should still have the right to try and make the best of yourself. Whether that means making political statements on behalf of a certain group or just posting a picture of your latest face mask, it depends on the individual. And the article also brings up that self-care has become a market. It's not really surprising since basically everything has a market nowadays. And the article also points out that there is a risk in self-care that people will become isolated to themselves and their own personal problems and lose sight of trying to fix the system that is causing them harm in the first place. It kind of goes back to what I said before about the level of self-care being an important factor on whether or not it is selfish. People so caught up in themselves that they cannot see the larger issues would be dangerous if society was made up exclusively of those people. The second article was called "Self-Care is an Act of Political War." And first off, the blatant amount of bias surprised me in this one. We haven't really read such a strongly opinionated article in class before, and it took me off guard. I'm not necessarily saying that it was good or bad, just that it was surprising to me. The article is from the point of view of a trans person, and the author says that trans people are apparently living with huge amounts of daily stress because of Trump being president, enough so to give rise to the term Trump anxiety disorder. The author brings up the Audre Lorde quote again that the last article talked about, which I thought was interesting, and they actually framed their entire article around that. The author also frames the political situation in America as Trump versus the disenfranchised, claiming that Trump is attempting to erase the humanity of so many of our diverse citizens, and that those citizens can fight back and, quote, defeat the problematic powers that be with self-care. Now, regardless of one's views on Trump and his policies, I think that it is a kind of ridiculous notion to think that they can somehow be defeated by self-care alone. The author later goes on to say that self-care might give one strength and mental health in order to fight back, but unless I seriously misunderstood something, the author never really explains what this fighting back looks like. From this statement and the others the author makes, it seems as though they do take certain self-care actions that are also related to supporting LGBTQ people, and I'm just wondering, is that what they're talking about in terms of fighting back? I'm not really sure. However, the only thing in the entire article mentioned that could potentially help bring down Trump and those powers that be was the author's canvassing of progressive candidates. And this, while it could be an avenue of self-care for the author as an individual, might not be self-care for others. Saying the general statement that self-care can help bring down those in power and their policies requires that one not look too deeply into the details beyond one's personal activities and self-care methods. It seems that the author is far too caught up with vehemence against Trump to take an unbiased look at their own point. And all throughout the article, the author practically screams to fight back over and over, but they never really explain how. Until they do, I'm not really buying that self-care on its own can do anything to produce massive political change. The author then goes to make a very important distinction that I fully agree with, which is the difference between self-care and self-indulgence. Whereas indulgence is more materialistic in its goals and methods, care is, for lack of a better term, more spiritual, in that it's aimed at achieving the best you can be in mind, body, and spirit. It's not motivated by materialistic ends, but rather seeking pure self-improvement, which I think is ideal. I think that self-indulgence is a lot of the selfishness that I was talking about in relation to the previous article. Later, the author continues airing their grievances with Trump's policies and comments, as well as further detailing the extent of the hardships that bisexual trans people face in America, as well as claiming that we live in a, quote, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy that he or they also adds is cis-heteronormative and albiest, that attempts to destroy the humanity of anyone who doesn't fit the vision of this list. Now, I think that this is a bit much. I preface this by fully saying that I myself am a straight white male living in the culture of a college campus, so I might simply not just be exposed to any of this in my daily life, and I'm open to the fact that I might be wrong. With that said, however, I simply do not believe that society as a whole is attempting to wipe out the notion that anyone who doesn't fit into that list's categories is human. Now, there is discrimination, obviously. I'm not going to try and argue that. What I'm saying is that this notion of attempting to pin this discrimination as the attitude of the entire American society, especially the level of discrimination the author describes, seems just nonsensical to me. Could President Trump and his administration have these prejudices along with others in power? That's fully debatable depending on which side of the aisle you're on. But saying that American society as a whole feels this way, again, I'm not buying it unless he or they provide some evidence to support the claim. Now, the author begins to define what his vision of self-care looks like later, talking about canvassing for progressive candidates and volunteering at their local LGBTQ support group, which gives them the strength to, quote, fight back. Again, not entirely sure what that means. Then the author simply summarizes his points and again mentions that self-care gives the strength and ability to fight back again. And I just simply find myself asking over and over, what does that mean? How are you going to bring down Trump and his policies with self-care? Are you talking about raising additional awareness for the issues you want addressed? Are you talking about campaigning for certain individuals or promoting specific policies? I just don't know what this concept of fighting back is, and I would really, really be interested in knowing what they were talking about. And the last article was an interview, again, Bell Hooks, Buddhism, the Beats, and Loving Blackness. So I'm going to preface this by pointing out that this was a long interview, and I'm going to be discussing mainly this in relation to the other articles and also within the realm of self-care. So it turns out that Bell Hooks is the person that the previous article quoted as us living in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And obviously my thoughts on the quote from the last article still apply. Hooks speaks of the connections between these systems and their equivalency as important notions, which is why she always strings them together. And I thought that that was an interesting line of thought. And if we accept all of these as true, then I fully agree that we should phrase them this way and connect them, because they would be connected. They are connected. Now, do I agree that society as a whole are these things? No, probably not, without me being presented some evidence beyond empty generalization. One of the questions in the interview revolved around the feminist movement. I found it interesting that Hooks described her commitment to the movement as militant. I found that wording choice obviously very deliberate and pretty interesting to frame the movement in that way. She then goes on to talk about how the feminist movement evolved to include race in its considerations, as even among women all are not equal, which I thought goes to back up her previous point on how we should consider all of these horrible systemic processes as interconnected. Then came the crucial question I was waiting for, which is how we should, in our daily lives, combat these supposedly all-present systems of oppression. And this is kind of what I wanted the last article to answer as well. And her response almost made me laugh, to be honest. She says that instead of asking herself, what would Jesus do, she asks herself, what does Martin Luther King want me to do today? And perhaps I can be called biased in my opinions here because I am a Christian, but I also think that I can explain from that perspective just how ludicrous that makes this statement sound, to be frank. As Christians, we try to imitate Jesus' life because he is God, because we are called to live that way in order to serve God. Martin Luther King was not God. To make him or any other mere human the absolute center of one's life and one's character and actions just seems like a completely senseless notion to me, especially when all of the good things that MLK promoted, Jesus would have as well. You know, the second most important commandment in the Bible is to love others, and only loving God comes before this. And obviously there is no room in love for hateful discrimination and prejudice. You know, Martin Luther King promoted a lot of good things, but I don't think that we should make any one flawed human being the absolute center of the morality of our lives. I think that's just a flawed system, no matter what religious belief you ascribe to, even if that's none whatsoever. And after making that comment, she discusses how she goes out and tries to relate to people in order to make a beloved community. She talks about her going places, meeting people, and then she makes another comment that I find hard to swallow. She claims that what she's doing is basically the same as the civil rights activists of the 60s because of the Kentucky hillbilly white persons who look at her with contempt. While I fully believe that she faces discrimination, I do not think that she necessarily draws an adequate equivalency between her actions and those of the 60s activists. They faced an institutionalized racist system of legal segregation. They could be punished with far more than just attitudes of contempt. They went through a lot of real personal risk to do what they were doing, and I think she kind of trivializes what they went through by putting herself at that level. At least by that comment. She may have faced, threats on that level that she didn't put in this interview, but if she's just talking about how she does in the interview about people looking at her with contempt about the things that she's doing, then I don't really support, again, her equivalency there. After this comment, Hooks brings up the importance of humanization, such as the last article, and her personal motivations, such as various points in history and seeing other people react to it. And then we finally get into some methods of hers for self-care. The next point she makes that stood out to me was that critical thinking could serve as a tool for healing. She uses this example of her parents discouraging her in the face of her talents, and in order to cope with the situation in a positive way, Hooks just pondered why her parents were like that, instead of holding it against them in a negative manner. It seems that this form of critical thinking serves as a method of self-care for her, and further demonstrates the differences between people and their vastly different methods of caring for self. She later reveals another method she uses for self-care, which is storing her anger and using it as energy later towards the good things she's trying to achieve. She compares anger to compost, something that can be recycled in order to promote positive growth, which I thought was cool. The next time she mentions a form of self-care is when she discusses how black people, especially in terms of men and women, need to live with much greater harmony and bonding than is normal nowadays, and how that can foster what she calls soul healing. She promotes this soul healing as a response to the emotional abandonment that black people, especially children, face, saying that if these abandonment issues are not resolved, black and biracial children may not have the opportunity to truly care for themselves. And this I found pretty interesting because it's an example of how self-care can help others, and in this case, by giving those others means for themselves to practice self-care. And the last method of self-care that was discussed was embracing spirituality, talking primarily about Hooke's Buddhist practices.